morning. Páiltear Rugh, who was joining us this morning for this report launch on the recent research carried out within MABS services in Dublin called Social Distancing on the Margins, which was compiled by Dr. Stuart Stamp. Now, just to put things in context, we're meeting and we're launching at a time when it's just a year now since the first lockdown changed our lives and changed the world we're in so many ways. And here we are now in March 2021, when there's a glimmer of light in terms of the vaccination rollout, which is happening in so many countries. And by this weekend, I heard Paul Reid saying this morning, about 750,000 people in the Republic will have received vaccinations. That's progress, but we're not out of it yet. That's the big concern. So we've seen enormous changes in people's lives, to services and supports, and we're focused in the main here on MABS services. And the impact of the last year has been on everybody, but it has been on some more than others. And this study focuses on that in particular in relation to MABS clients in the Dublin region, 2 regions in Dublin. So there are lessons that have been learned already, and responses have been and changes have been made in the past year. But there are more lessons as we plan ahead for all of us, both in those in the policy making area and in the service provision area in particular. So, as you join us now for this launch, I just want to introduce our three speakers. And in the first instance, we'll have Dr. Stuart Stamp, who is the author of this research and report. And he will be followed by Nessun Vaughan, who is the chair of Dublin North MABS and chair of a number of other bodies. And I will refer to Nessun further, but Nessun comes with a long public service background. And our final speaker will be Angela Black, who is Chief Executive of the Citizens Information Board. You know, since November 2014, as I know, and shortly moving on, transitioning out of that role into hopefully new pastures. But anyway, we will start. If you're happy, we'll go ahead now. We will start with Dr. Stuart Stamp, and just a brief bio on Dr. Stuart Stamp. Stuart has been closely involved over many years as a researcher in the area of personal and financial indebtedness and areas such as poverty and equality, and also on public policy. And his doctorate, Stuart's doctorate back in 2012 was in personal debt policy and poverty. And he is attached as an associate to the Department of Applied Social Studies in NUI Maynooth. And I've known Stuart, I think maybe, certainly 15 years or more, going back to my days in combat poverty. And he's the perfect person for this type of timely research, which, as he will explain, you know, looks back at a period in the early days of the impact, or the early months of the impact of COVID on MABS and its client base in Dublin in particular. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Stuart. And just to remind people before we do that, that you have on your screens, you have a Q&A button which you can avail of if you wish to put in a question or two to any of the speakers. And we will pick up those questions after each of the presentations have been made. So you were invited to do that. And you will also notice, in terms of our technology, the speaker will be, you know, the main person you should hear. We're minimizing all technology distractions as best we can. So I'm now just going to hand you over to Stuart.
Thanks a million, Sean. Hello, everybody. Good morning. I still find these webinars weird, I have to say. I much prefer the in-person, less socially distanced sort of mode of doing these things, but we are where we are. So just to welcome and thank you all for attending this morning. Yeah, I mean, and it's very kind of Sean and Sean's kind words at the start, very grateful for those. But this research is really a team effort, and I just want to put that up front at the start, and to thank a number of people involved in it, really. First of all, every research needs a funder, and we were very fortunate to get a social policy grant from the Citizen Information Board, Geraldine and her team there. It needs a driver, and we had a steering group, a very proactive, positive steering group, Marion, Carol, and Phyllis and Twiggy. So we had north and south of the river represented, and they kept me very focused and are very passionate about this area. Many of them, all of them, in fact, have worked in MABS for many, many years. It needs a backer. And we're fortunate to have the boards of Dublin North and South Region MABS to back us, and the regional managers, Ali and Gwen. And crucially, it needs informers. It needs people to inform the research. And I'd like to thank Philippe from MABS Support, CLG, who provided all the MABS data to us, which was hugely important to the research, as you'll see. And also to the 50 staff, 50 money advisors right across the region who fed in to the research with their experiences and perspectives of how COVID was playing out amongst their client base, as Sean says, in the early months of COVID. And also I'd like to thank Annette McMahon for helping me with some of the graphs and charts, which isn't really my forte and skill, as many of you will know. So any piece of research also needs motivation. What's the motivation for the research? Well, the motivation here was really the disruption, of course, caused by COVID, and we all know about that. But amongst the money advisors, there was a sense that this disruption was impacting on two things: one, on people's budgets and the way they managed the money and dealt with debt, but also on the relationship between the money advisor and the client, which obviously, as Sean said, MABS has a long history and so on, but a lot of it is sort of in-person dealing, advisor-client. And of course, COVID threw that completely, and we needed to develop new methods of working. So the disruption was sort of both intra-service, if you like, within the MABS client engagement, and also beyond in terms of how clients were managing the money. I think the key thing is that they felt that some people were being affected more than others. And that's really the driver for this research. Who are the people who are more affected in a financial sense by COVID, and how is it playing out in their lives? So the timing of the research, yes, as Sean said, it was conducted last summer, over the summer, and it's in two bits. So the quantitative piece of the research, the statistics, the numbers, which when you're looking at the report is sort of the first bit of the findings. What we were looking at there was the client base between the 13th of March and the 30th of June. Okay, so 13th of March was the date when restrictions started to really kick in, and we went to the end of that quarter, if you like, to the end of June, to look at were there any changes in the client base during those first few months of COVID, and if so, what were those changes and how were they playing out? So it was, if you like, trying to get an initial sense of where problems might be coming down the track and for whom. And then there was a second piece, which is a more qualitative piece, where we asked money advisors across the region. And as I say, we got 50 responses, which was just wonderful. I asked them for their perspectives, their experiences of dealing with clients, as I say, a little bit down the road. That was in September. So at that stage, we were moving towards a gradual reopening. Goodness me, it's been a real roller coaster, hasn't it? I can't remember how many levels we've been through. My brother calls it level 42, which for those of you of a certain musical sort of persuasion, you remember them well. But I can't remember what level we were at actually in September. But what I do know is that I think the timing of the research launch today is actually very good, because we're pretty much where we were sort of 12 months ago, really, in terms of looking at coming through or looking into the future as far as we can. So just to hope that's clear, there's a quantitative piece and there's a qualitative piece to this research. Its objectives, as I say, first, we wanted to try and see whether there are any differences in the client base. And I should point out, this is the active client base, the base that money advisors across the region, they were working with clients who were live cases, if you like, at the time. We wanted to look at were there any changes in terms of people's money management and the way they were budgeting and, as I say, paying and managing money. And also, were there any, COVID had any impacts in terms of the way they were dealing with debt, the debt problems that they had? So those the three objectives really. But of course, to any research, there's a context. And the context of the research here is really important. So when COVID struck, it didn't find a blank canvas here. There were already a lot of people already in financial difficulty, in trouble. MABS were dealing with a large number of clients in March when COVID and social distancing really struck. There was also obviously a lot of legacy debts, which we're familiar with, dating back in some cases to the mid-noughties and predating the mortgage arrears crisis. So there are already a large pool of people already in trouble. But more broadly, there are also issues around inequality and poverty in society. And those issues were there before COVID struck. And it's important to recognize that. And inequality and poverty and deprivation and unemployment, all those trends were going in the right direction. They were all coming down, which is good. But they were coming down gradually. And we have to remember that when COVID struck, a large amount of people in Ireland were in poverty, they were in consistent poverty, they were experiencing deprivation, inequality, financial exclusion, and all the rest of it. So that's a very, very important context. And we know that COVID has amplified those inequalities in society. And I know Nessun is going to talk a bit about that. But certainly it's also done so in a personal finance sense. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Of course, a lot of supports were put in place, income supports and household protection supports, which have been very, very important. But for many people, the social distancing that we all sort of, I won't say we take for granted, but we've all sort of become used to, that affected people in different ways, and particularly in a personal financial sense. So of course, there were some people used to paying for things in cash, going to the post office, using in-person methods of bill payment and so on, and even dealing with MABS in that way. And now all of a sudden, people were having to move or try and look at alternatives. And of course, for many people, that was quite seamless and they were able to do so. But for others, that presented huge challenges. People who were unbanked or sort of had a preference for use of cash or paying things in person. So it's important just to put the context in there before we get into the findings. I hope that's sort of clear. So of course, COVID strikes and all the supports that we know now put in place very rapidly, really. And of course, and what happened to the cases, and we know this from the MABS data, is in Q2 cases went down from Q1. And that also was the case in terms of live cases as well. Those cases also dropped, although not by as much. But although the cases dropped, what we were looking for was to see were there any particular groups between that March and June period who seemed to be using MABS services slightly more than others. And we identified 5. And they were groups, people in receipt of social welfare, people who are 65 and over, lone parents and single persons, private tenants, and people who were living with friends or family. They were the sort of 5 groups, if you like. And the divergences were small, but they were noticeable. And I think that's important because that tells us where we may find problems occurring down the line amongst groups, perhaps in some cases, people who hadn't experienced debt problems before. And I think the thing that struck, well, certainly the thing that struck me when we were looking at the MABS data was when you looked at the people that approached MABS in that first quarter after COVID, the March to June period, an awful lot of those people, around 8 in 10, we calculate, were brand new to MABS. In other words, they'd never engaged with MABS at all, as far as we could see before that. And that was quite different to the period leading up to COVID, where an awful lot of people who were live, active MABS clients had actually maybe come and gone a little bit in the past. They'd been a client some years ago, they had the case closed perhaps, and then they'd come back to MABS. So this seemed to be a new cohort of clients. And this very much bears out a lot of the research and the talk at the moment, that when COVID plays out, that we're going to find a lot of people who had never had financial difficulty before in need of help and likely to be approaching MABS services. So that's the sort of quantitative numbers piece. I hope that makes sense. There's some divergences there, and you could see some trends which I think point to where we might be going in the future. And then we had the qualitative piece to the research. And I think the best way to think about this, and I should say, sorry, a lot of those quantitative findings, the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, which released a piece of research yesterday that many of you will have seen, actually says very similar things, I think, to what we found, which is really interesting because that research was only undertaken, as I understand it, in recent weeks and months. So I think that there's a very interesting sort of corroboration there. So yeah, the qualitative findings, and I think the best way to think of this is to look at sort of two sides of a coin. So amongst the MABS client base, there were people who were doing better now financially. And these were generally people who were working, who were in employment, who their costs are cut down because they weren't traveling or they weren't having lunches out or whatever it is. So one group had more disposable income. Some had payment breaks, some had moratoria and so on. But the other side of the coin is the really important side, I think, and the side that really shines through in this research. And that's a group that were doing worse as a result of COVID. Their expenses have gone up, and their incomes obviously were low to start with in many cases. So just to make the point that some people were doing sort of okay, maybe a little bit better at times, but others weren't. And they're the group I want to look at just in the last few minutes of my presentation here. And maybe the way to think about it is to think of the 3 Ps, and I'm going to call them poverty, precarity, and partnership. So if we take poverty first, we know from a body of research that MABS clients in general tend to be on lower incomes than the population at large. So they're already on a low income to start with. So when you add on to low income, added expense, and we know from COVID that for a lot of people are spending more time at home, so they're using more fuel, there's more bodies in the home, perhaps the adult children have come back to the nest, they're consuming more, as we all know. So you end up with not just lower income, but also higher expenses. So that obviously increases poverty, it pushes some people into poverty. But there's another side to poverty, as you all know, which is social exclusion, which is that poverty means you can't participate as much in society as others. You can't sort of do what people do in general. And the social inclusion piece we found is very much linked to the financial exclusion issue, which is people's inability to access and use financial services, banks, credit, insurance, and all the rest of it. But the real issue here we found was that it's people, by and large, for many people, the whole business of information technology, what we're doing this morning through Zoom, you know, many people operating through WhatsApp and email and goodness knows what. And that works for many, many people, and many people adapted very well to COVID as a result and to dealings with personal finances. But for others who were financially excluded, maybe relying on cash, as I say, or in-person sort of transactions, it presented a real difficulty. And there's actually some very interesting examples in the report of really good things that happened. People who became used to dealing with things electronically, people who opened internet banking and got used to it and found it very empowering. So there were some people within, if you like, the excluded group who were able to be brought in to sort of the financially included group, if you like, but not everyone. And it's the people on the margins, by and large, who are marginalised to start with, who have had the most difficulty around this. So that's poverty. And then the next P is precarity. And again, sort of two sides to this particular issue. The first is precarious income. And we know about this, you know, there's been a lot written about people in precarious income, services and so on. Construction and all the rest of it, having real difficulties. But I was really struck by an interview Michelle O'Hara gave, regional manager for MABS, on the radio some time ago, where she said, who would have ever thought that an aircraft pilot would be in a precarious income, in precarious work? And I think that was a really powerful example of how COVID has actually blown open this issue of precarious work. There's many more people now in precarious work that we may not have thought of before. But the other side of precarity is in terms of budgets. And And there's quite a big piece in the report where we look at the issue, as many of you will recall, when payments, social welfare payments, went from 1 week to 2 weeks. You remember this, many of you. And that, for many people, just threw them completely, threw the budget out. People ran out of money by the end of the second week, often had to go without or cut back. And I think what that tells us is just how precarious many people's budgets are, even when they're involved with MABS. Because at the root of all this, as we've mentioned before, is poverty and inequality and lack of income to start with. So that precarity of budgets, I think, is a very important takeaway from the research. And the third and final sort of set of qualitative findings, I think we could call partnership. And by partnership, I'm talking here about the relationship between money advisors and their clients. And there was an awful lot of concern. You could feel it from some money advisors and not so much from others about how COVID and social distancing had impacted on the relationship between MABS and their clients, which usually, as we know, is often based on in-person contact. It's based on building trust, relationships, and so on. And again, for some clients, this worked well. And we've got several money advisors were talking about how it actually had speeded up the process dealing with things remotely. For many people, it suited them if they were at work, for instance. You know, they were familiar with the whole to and froing of information and communication electronically and remotely. And so for some clients, it worked very, very well. But for others, and particularly clients who were used to dealing with MABS in a particular way, perhaps through a drop-in sort of method, if you like, who really valued the interpersonal contact that they had with the money advisors, things had changed and it had affected that relationship. And it's becoming more difficult even to do basic things such as get signed authority, and people were becoming frustrated about, you know, doing the things which are very easily done when you're working in person. So I hope you're seeing the theme here that actually, you know, there's two sides to this coin. There's different groups. The MABS client base is not a homogenous group. They're not all the same. Some people maybe have done better, at least in the short term, but then there's a lot who have actually been affected quite profoundly, we think. So that's the end of the findings, really. Just a few final comments going forward. Maybe the last examples point a way forward for MABS, maybe the idea of a twin track sort of approach where some clients you can deal with electronically and remotely, and that works well for them, but then others will still need that in-person sort of support that needs to be provided, I think, going forward, hopefully if and when we come out of the current situation. And the second thing going forward is I think we need to think in general a lot more about people on the margins. We really need to marginalisation proof any measures that we take going forward. And what struck me is that often as a researcher, you come in, you do a piece of research and you go on to the next one. MABS is in a really unique position because money advisors up and down the country are the first, almost like the canaries in the coal mine. They actually hear the issues coming in real time, straight away. And I think we need to try and think about how we can find ways, not just MABS, but the Society of Interpol, Threshold, FLAC, everybody who's working in this sort of space. How can we somehow get together and feed these things in from the ground up much more quickly and regularly, perhaps, than has been done heretofore? And just a final thing to say is there's a lot of talk about the idea of debts being, if you like, incubated at the moment, and that there is going to be, you know, some sort of spike or surge or whatever we like to call it down the road. And I think our research sort of confirms that. And in fact, the MABS data, if you look at what happened in Q3 when society started to open up, and you'll see in the report, which coincided with that period, many advisors were talking about people coming in with disconnection notices, you know, demands for payments and so on. So I think that the numbers, that the change in MABS statistics between Q2 and Q3, I think really gives us, if you like, a portent of what is to come down the road. So I'd like to finish with a couple of well wishes, if I may, Sean, just before I go. First is I'd like to wish Angela well in her forthcoming retirement. my better half took a similar plunge a couple of weeks ago. She's absolutely very, very chilled and relaxed about all of this and enjoying it. So I hope you have a similar experience. We've worked together on many of these launches, Angela, mortgage arrears and traveller issues and illegal money lending, fuel poverty, and now this one on COVID. Angela's always been very supportive of the research that we've done, and has got behind the issues that have been raised. So I'd like to thank her for that. I'd say and wish her well into the future. And just finally, like to wish all across the MABS network. I don't quite know who's here participant-wise today, but I'm sure many of you work in MABS up and down the land. But Gwen Harris informed me or reminded me recently that MABS is 30 years old next year, which is quite extraordinary in many ways. And when you think about it, MABS has adapted from money lending, dealing with money lending issues, through to dealing with the personal credit boom in the noughties, to the mortgage arrears crisis beyond, and personal insolvency and so on. And I'm sure, and it is adapting again to COVID, and it will continue to adapt, I'm sure. But I'd like just to wish all of you out there in the field well for the months that are to come, and obviously the dealing with the problems that will emerge. And the final wish, I'm sure you wish me to get off the stage now. You've probably heard enough from me, so I'm going to exit quietly stage left and hand back to Sean. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. You're not going anywhere yet, because we now have an opportunity for a Q&A. And if there are at this stage, I think we have 74 participants. So it's I hope it's a good representation across services and other interested parties who have joined us. I have one or two questions rising from what you said, just to get things going, if I may. First thing, one of the details you touched on there was around marginalisation proofing, the changes, particularly any policy changes that might be brought in the next while. And I got the impression you're talking about all policy makers or service providers, and I take that to include MABS as well. But anyway, if you want to comment on that further, are there any particular concerns you might have that would, when you say this is a critical step to take in terms of any changes being proofed?
Yeah, well, I suppose what struck me, Sean, it was the move to 2-week payments. It was actually that what brought it to mind. And I'd say when that was done, it was done for whatever reason, maybe expediency or whatever it was. But that's the type of thing I'm thinking about, and that one measure, just for so many people, was a profound change. They really had difficulty coping with it. So if we're thinking of things like that, I just think we need to involve groups, organizations that represent those groups more in the policy process. We need to be, like I say, developing more regular ways to actually feed in information. So in that instance, if we're going to make a change, let's try and make sure that the people who are going to be impacted by it are as prepared as they can be for it, so we can be proactive, rather than it just happening and then you're reacting to it afterwards. So that was the sort of thing I had in mind. Obviously, as we unwind the supports through the summer, hopefully, if the vaccination program goes well, there's going to be a very difficult period. I think everybody recognises that. And yes, MABS itself has to get ready for that, to think about that. How are we going to deal with the demands that are going to be placed upon us at that point? So it's more of a general point, Sean, sorry, rather than a specific one.
Okay. Now, I'm just picking up in terms of keep an eye on the Q&A panel as it appears in front of me here. I have one other question before I, other speakers may well wish to come in. And I'll just noting the questions that are coming in. One other area that you touched on in your presentation there was around feeding in what I call informed comment, like say MABS, the MABS staff themselves, in terms of the whole area of experience on the ground, and feeding that in maybe more quickly. Is that what you had in mind? I mean, some mechanism for getting input into policy making fora more quickly. Is that what you had in mind in that idea?
It is, Sean, it is, yeah. I mean, and it's just maybe, I'm just throwing something out there, but I mean, I remember many years ago in the 90s, there was a series of committees, of subcommittees and policy subcommittees looking at different areas, different aspects, utilities or whatever it was. And the idea of that was a way to provide a home for particular issues to go into, and then they could be channeled, fairly quickly to the people that needed to hear it. So it was that type of thing I was thinking in mind, more regular sort of groupings, more regular channels, if you like. Now, people on the panel will probably, and throughout MABS will know better than I how that's working out on the ground. But it certainly strikes me that, when I was doing this research, that the issues that were coming up, people had been picking those up for a little while. And, there have been ways like that of the sort of subcommittees and so on that have been used to try and channel those issues to the people who need to hear them, rather than waiting for a piece of research and then sort of reacting to it.
Very good. Okay. I'm taking a question that came in from Fidel McCostow, and here it is now. How important do you think resumption of face-to-face appointments for the marginalised is when the COVID guidelines permit that?
Hi, Fidelma. I mean, it's absolutely vital. And I think that's one of the things that struck us most about this report, that although there will be people who will remote engagement works very well for, and that's great and that's fine, and MABS has clearly adapted around that. The face-to-face dimension is absolutely crucial. As I say, many MABS service users use MABS in a different way, I think, than maybe people who use it more remotely do. So, if they're paying a bill somewhere or they're in a centre, MABS is nearby, they'll drop in. Many people need that sort of option, if you like, of that ability to drop in, and it might be the only person they've seen all week. There's a really wonderful quote towards the end of the report from a money advisor who talked about just talking to a client, just picking up the phone and having a chat. And that sort of informal but hugely important sort of side effect, if you like, of money advice, that interpersonal dealing can be so important for people, that they feel supported, they feel listened to, they feel heard. And in my view, the face-to-face dimension is hugely important. It's the bread and butter, really, and particularly for groups in those marginalised situations, which is really where MABS came from. As we remember, those of us around 30 years ago, its primary target group was low-income social welfare families and other low-income families and groups. And I think that face-to-face dimension is hugely important for certain groups in society who, that works for them, and we should make sure it continues to work for them.
Just a comment made by Mary Waters. She's talking about the relevance of much of what you've been talking about with citizens' information as well as to MABS. So I think that's important to note as well, because we have citizen information colleagues here as well, which is good. Just one, can I go back to the body of recommendations that you touched on, and there's more in the report. People hopefully will be able to see when the wider audience and others outside access the report after today via MABS website. And that's in relation to the recommendations you touched on, if you like, a whole series of recommendations that stemmed from the participants in the work you did. A lot came from the ground up from staff as well. And then you added on a few of your own observations, and we talked about marginalisation as one of those. From this work, do you see any particular recommendations that might be actioned or taken up at national or appropriate levels without too much delay or without any major investment? Or difficult question, I know, but are there anything that you might say, why don't we work on this quickly, because it's not the hardest thing in the world to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the communication channels, I think some of the advisors were suggesting that they could improve sometime. They might be localized issues, Sean. I'm not 100% sure, so there will be localized issues that can be dealt with, I think, maybe in that way. There was a recommendation about a sort of an electronic sort of portal, a MABS sort of thing. I don't know whether that's, I'm not a techie, but the idea that there could be some way for those for whom remote engagement works well, there could be some way of maybe building on that. That might be quicker, but you need to have more techie people than me talking about that. The one thing I would say, and I think it's something myself and my colleague Paul Joyce from FLAC, who we've been working together on a number of these issues over the years, have talked about a lot, is this imbalance of power between creditors and debtors, well-resourced, well-financed creditors and public creditors and private creditors, and individual, if you like, atomized individuals acting on their own, albeit with the support of MABS. And one of the things we've talked a lot about there is the importance of rights for people, a focus on rights. And I think if you look at what happened in the early stages of the pandemic, for instance, with payment breaks, there was no right to a payment break. The payment break was dependent on the institution sort of saying, yes, okay, yes, you're a candidate for a payment break. The utility, when the utility moratoria ran out, there was no right to have your fuel kept on, even though it was circumstances beyond your control that had pushed you into a situation of difficulty. So I think just in general, I'd love to see much more of a focus on rights for people and giving people access to those rights, rather than leaving that imbalance of power really very much in the creditor's favour. And that's, I think, where we still are in many ways. And I think that needs to change.
Okay. One other question came in from participant, and read out the best I can here. What do you think should be developed in order to provide solution and support-based options that would encompass money advice for clients? The comment is made that we all believe, that we all believe these will the issues that will present when we start to return to normal. So I think you're touching on that, like, we don't know what's coming down the line, but there's plenty of stuff coming down the line.
Yeah.
And this to be done while ensuring we focus on those in poverty or the most vulnerable. So I'll try and repeat that again in terms of solution and support-based options, with a particular focus on those in poverty or the most vulnerable.
Yeah, so I'm on mute. No, I'm not on mute. So yeah, I mean, one of the things I think, one of the fascinating things I think that came out of this research, and perhaps of where many of the services are located in Dublin, was a lot of it actually took me back to the 90s. A lot of the issues that we were talking about were not so much debt solutions. They were more about getting through the week or even getting through the day. So the contribution, I think, is talking about the poverty side of things. So I think there's one block of work there that's just helping people to have, some sort of standard of living that protects their essentials. It's what money advisors do day in, day out. And I think this research really re-highlighted, if you like, the importance of that as if you like, the kernel of much of what MABS does. But the other side, yes, the debt solution piece. I mean, we know that there are statutory solutions available now that weren't there, 10 years ago. There's obviously the voluntary solutions through MABS and so on. And there's people better qualified than I to talk about the personal insolvency situation and the improvements that need to be made there. And I know MABS has made recommendations. I know FLAC has made recommendations. I know many money advisors have had things to say about it as well. So obviously that needs to be improved hugely. That needs to be much more accessible and usable by people in that sense, in terms of the statutory solutions. But for people who don't necessarily want to go that route for understandable reasons, the voluntary option through MABS has to be there. So it's the way of actually, if you like, my belief is that people should be given all the options, and you present people, and that's what MABS does effectively. It says, look, these are the range of options. Which one do you want to choose? Bearing in mind your situation, and we'll support you with it. So I suppose I divide it into two. I hope that makes sense. The sort of the bread and butter sort of management, having some sort of as Brendan Roach used to say, light in the bulb, food in the belly, roof over the head.
Yeah.
30 years ago he was saying that, and it's still as relevant
still
today.
So relevant. Exactly.
But also the other side is the sort of actually getting out of debt rather than just managing it. And clearly our statutory options could be an awful lot better than they are at the moment.
I have two more briefly now. I'm conscious of time, but I think it's important to take these. Martin Cowley raised the question of money lending. First of all, have you any views in particular about the rise in money lending, which seems to be evident? And the other point he raised in relation to the risk to the disadvantage long term in terms of any recession arising where we are now and continued levels of unemployment and the pressure on national finances. Any comments on either of those two areas first?
Yeah, I mean, Paul and I have done some work on illegal. I'm not sure he's talking about money lending, licensed money lending, obviously, because that's been in the news recently with the moves towards an interest rate cap. We've done some work, Paul and I, on illegal money lending, which it's hard to get a read on these situations, but our view is that it's happening, it's out there. It's very difficult to know or to put an actual sort of number on it and so on. But I think coming out of COVID, maybe the two issues are linked. Illegal money lending is really as a result of financial exclusion and of course poverty as well. So one of the things we've recommended in a national traveller MABS report that Andrew and I launched just before Christmas was this idea of a national financial inclusion strategy, that we really need to get back to seeing all these problems, if you like, within a framework, within in the round. So the idea of money lending and credit rating, which I think was maybe the second part of that question, to me, they all come within that umbrella of financial exclusion. And we've made, during the about 2011 onwards, we had a financial inclusion strategy here, which was very innovative and progressive, but it seems to have disappeared, died a death almost. And in the National Travel MABS study, we were calling for that to be brought back onto the policy agenda, because within financial inclusion, you can then begin to address these problems, which don't stand alone. Illegal money lending, there's a lot more we could do about that in terms of enforcement and providing alternatives and seeing people more as victims and dealing with things in a much more supportive sort of way. But the other side of that coin is people will need to borrow, and we need to look at access to credit, affordable credit, and indeed trying to make sure that people don't need to borrow in the first place. So I know it's a bit of a roundabout way, but I hope it makes sense. I think we need to think about these things more strategically, and I think financial exclusion is a very useful idea or concept for dealing with those sort of issues like illegal money lending, like credit rating, and so on. And we need to up our game, really. And COVID's given us an opportunity to do it, but we need to take it.
I'm conscious of time, but there are two others I want to just squeeze in alongside the next one I was going to refer to, which is any observations on what this person, Ami Lojoie, said is the dominant narrative at the moment about household finance well-being in terms of people being flush with savings and a spending boom being down the road. Any comments on that? That's one issue. The other thing is, do you see, Margaret is talking about the potential for a new line of clients coming our way, people who never use a service, like perhaps more self-employed debt clients or whatever. Any views on that? And then the final thing is the disappearing facility for special accounts, and that was something that was particularly relevant to vulnerable clients in the past with MABS. Who had no access to bank accounts, and then issues around credit union links up and down in various ways in the last while. But there's three issues, very different, but I mean some relate to the changing focus and whether or not we can be misled by positive messages about we're all loaded with money and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Got about overtime here.
This is it now. This is definitely it. I'm closing off after these.
Yeah. Okay. No. So the savings issue, absolutely. The narrative is out there, absolutely. But it's groups and individuals who are on, if you like, looking at things through a different lens. We need to be vocal on that. And I think the Vincent de Paul study published yesterday was an excellent one around that. It was really trying to shine a different light on it, because I think it feeds into, there is maybe an element of policy complacency around at the moment. I think that somehow things are quiet and we'll come through this nice and quietly. If the last crisis tells us anything, that won't happen. So I think maybe I agree there is a narrative around that, but there's clearly another narrative that we're, I think, trying to put forward in this study. But there is a sense of complacency, and I think it's important that all of us sort of try and work on that and maybe sort of try and change the narrative. The second one was the new clients, I think, Sean, wasn't it?
Yeah. What do you see? Do you see a new clientele emerging out of all this?
Yeah, and I think if you look at, I think if you look at the Central Statistics Office data on sort of, and indeed the Department of Social Protection data on people claiming the pandemic unemployment payment and on the wage support schemes, you begin to get a real sense of where the new client base is going to come from. And we just don't know, do we, until this all, begins to play out, how many businesses are viable, how many will keep going. So you're right, it might be people who own those businesses or self-employed people, but also the people that work in those businesses will also obviously be affected. And as these supports begin to taper, I think those data sets give us a clue. I think we mentioned some of them in the study, but there's more recent data, of course, out there. So I think keeping an eye on those trends will give us a sense of where the new clients may be coming from. And also, of course, to look at the MABS client base over time and continue to track it and see are there any new trends beginning to emerge there. And the final one, the special account, I was always a great believer and I'm a big fan of special accounts. I think it's an option for people. And I know the view, and it is true that there are way more financial service options now to MABS clients and people than there were 20 years ago or 30 years ago or even 10 years ago, and basic banking and all the rest of it. But I think the special account does have a role to play again for certain people, and again for some people it can, the relationship with MABS, it's sort of, many people require more intensive support, they require longer term support, and I think special accounts had a really powerful role to play in all of that. And I know I suspect there are reasons why special accounts are not used as much now. And there might, the view might be, well, look, you've all these alternatives. But the idea of I always thought of it as a client account rather than a special account. It was a MABS client account, and it was another option for a MABS client. And it could be used as sort of a halfway house, if you like, a stepping stone into full financial inclusion. But in the short term, it could certainly be used not just to pay bills, but also to begin to build up credibility in terms of credit with the credit union. If you, as was the case, you're repaying your bills and debt, through the credit union client account. So I think it could be used. It has a role to play, I think, as one of a suite of options, and it may be, as I say, for some people more than others.
I'm very grateful, Stuart. I'm sure the viewers, participants appreciate the time and effort you put into this and your readiness to comment. So again, many thanks. I'm now going to move on to Nessun Vaughan, who's our next speaker. And Nessun has a long background in public sector and also in support for and engagement in the charity and community voluntary area as well. Nessun is the chair of Dublin North MABS, and that's the formal, I suppose, capacity in which he's speaking to this report and to Stuart's presentation. And as Stuart has said, it's timely with your own active involvement at national, local level in SVP that you're speaking today, and also I think the context of the recently formed National One Parent Family Alliance. Because a lot of these issues are common areas of common ground areas for all our services. So you're very welcome, Nessun, and I'll hand over to you now for your presentation.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Sean. And you can relax now, Stuart. I'm delighted to be here, and I just want to congratulate Stuart on a fine report and a timely report. And I think he's right that we're almost back to where we were a year ago. I want to thank also, of course, my colleagues in North Dublin MABS, Gwen Harris, the manager, and Ali Fattel and Dublin South MABS for collaborating on this, which is MABS needs to do a lot more of that, even though we're independent companies. So this is one such example. I just really want to talk a lot of the ground has been covered by Stuart, both in the questions and answers and in the report itself, and in this presentation. But just say I suppose I'm informed by some of the work I do with Vincent de Paul, with Northside Partnership, and many community groups in the inner city of Dublin and on the north side, and there are common themes. One area I just really want to emphasize, perhaps above all else, is the exacerbation of inequality as a result of the pandemic. And I heard a professor, a medic on Morning Ireland yesterday, I can't remember his full name, Professor Seamus, I forget his surname, but in Cork, but he said, it was just one line I picked up on, and he said, pandemics magnify inequities, and I think that's, we can relate to that. And I think a lot of the reports and commentary since the pandemic, which is just now over a year, have supported that. Not just anecdotally, which we know from engaging with people on an individual basis, but on various reports too. Stuart's there, points to that. The SRI has talked about, they had a report recently where it shows that quite a number of people have accumulated savings. So a lot of people who are more middle class, who would spend a fair bit of money on holidays, multiple holidays, eating out, food, etc., are accumulating money. So hopefully the economy will benefit when restrictions are eased. But they are in many ways better off in a financial sense, and they've continued to work. Whereas other people in precarious and low-paid employment perhaps are not working, but also they are spending and have to spend more money on food, on heating, and even trying to get connected digitally. And of course, we know about the digital divide. We know about already there's evidence of inequality in education, where people haven't had the opportunity to engage properly in education, where the homes aren't conducive to study, where there's physical cramping, where parents may not have the necessary resources within themselves to support their children in education. And of course, education is the single biggest factor in addressing inequality and poverty, which we used to say employment, but it is education now. And the findings, Stuart's findings mirror to a great extent some of the early reports from Vincent de Paul. And I'll come back to what Vincent de Paul said yesterday, and Stuart has mentioned quite a number of them there, but it's timely. But even early days of the restrictions, when the first lockdown was, the people who were engaging with Vincent de Paul were very similar to, the trends were very similar to what MABS is experiencing. An increase in people, single adults living alone, often with health issues. Carers, people having to look after who became carers in many ways, because the normal carers or resource centres and drop-in centres for people were closed. So they were not able to work, but they had to look after their maybe be it siblings or family members. Over 65s, increasing number of over 65s engaging, who are, I suppose, were cocooning, to use that phrase that came in vogue, and weren't able to go out and do their normal financial translations, and they deal mainly in cash to a great extent, and not online banking and so forth. Travellers, of course, who have suffered hugely, both during the pandemic, and who are one of the most marginalised groups in our society, if not the most marginalised. People, as I mentioned, in precarious and part-time employment, people doing, funny enough, essential services too. There was a recognition at one level that they're doing essential services, but they're low paid actually. Many of those people providing essential services to keep our economy going, to keep our society going, who are still doing actually in low paid employment. That was one pattern that, and findings that endorse, that is corroborated, to use Stuart's term, by SVP, but as I say, other reports from ESRI. I'm also conscious that behind all those figures, there are people, real people, MABS, frontline people engage with them, obviously, maybe remotely at the moment. But the Vincentian Partnership for Social Justice did a very good report that was commissioned by the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, where it did a case studies on people who are living below what they call, and which is now accepted, the minimum essential standard of living, the MESL. And there's a significant differential between what's considered the minimum essential standard of living, that people can live with dignity, not with excess and not in luxury. The differential between that and the social welfare payments. And it was very interesting when the pandemic unemployment payment was first set, how it was significantly higher than basic job seekers allowance and job seekers benefit. Why was that, I wonder? Was that a recognition implied or by accident that the job seeker allowance and job seekers benefit is inadequate for people, for a person to live in dignity? And I asked that question rhetorically. I think we know the answer to that. So the findings, I say, are good because they support what's elsewhere, and hopefully they will inform government and policy as the supports that have been put in place. And I want to say, on a positive note, they're very welcome supports that government put in place at very short notice. The pandemic employment payment itself, that was put in place almost overnight. And I think that did impact on the move to fortnightly payments, Stuart. I think, well, I'm not an apologist for the Department of Social Protection, but I think they were processing something like 1 million payments a week, so I do understand that. Nevertheless, that did impact adversely on people who are used to weekly payments. The moratorium on evictions, the moratorium on disconnections. And of course, there are fears now about withdrawing some of those protections for tenants in private residence. And I know Threshold, I think, who are here, have spoken very strongly about that in recent times. So it shows, I think the pandemic has shown as well, that things which were considered that could not be done, that there were all sorts of reasons it couldn't be allowed, even legal reasons, were found to not to be the case. So crisis can show, often produces solutions as well. So I think we need to learn from that. I want to turn to as well, wearing my MABS hat too, and the Dublin region and elsewhere indeed throughout the MABS family, the responsiveness by MABS very quickly and the agility to retain and maintain the services by and large in extraordinary circumstances, unforeseen. Within days, people exited, moved from home, continued to provide, for example, the National Helpline, which is North Dublin has responsibility for at the moment, kept a helpline going, and at the other end of it, phone line for people using other various channels, multimedia channels, including social media, Messenger, WhatsApp, emails, FaceTime, all sorts of using modern technology and Zoom and so forth, and that people adapted very quickly to. And we will look at maybe retaining a number of those. Also engaging through community education, using employers, reaching out to people who are in employment and maybe low-paid employment, who need advice and money advice. And quite a number of people we know are in employment, but in low-paid employment. But using things like prepaid envelopes, information tips, tip sheets, and a variety of support tools that were developed very creatively, and then that were disseminated both physically and using other channels, social media, etc. Radio, local radio, etc., Near FM, FM 104, reaching people where we're likely to reach. And not that maybe the programs people here might always listen to, but what we think other media that people access. So I think that has been enormously helpful, and lessons to be learned, but also working in partnership with other agencies. And there's such, so many examples of that, because no one agency has all the answers, and to need to look beyond our own confines. So for example, we talk about, financial management and community education. There's a very good initiative there in place with Task, and I hope, I'm not sure whether Task are with us this morning, but they do, the independent think tank who do wonderful work as well. They're working with us, with MABS, excuse me, and the Northside Partnership, with funding supplied by JP Morgan and Financial Management Skills Training. And that came out of a report. And I know Amy's here, all right. I heard there was a question from Amy Lajoie from Task, who did a report on household indebtedness there last year. And out of that came that particular initiative. Obviously, there's a lot of increased cooperation with SVP and MABS, both at local level, regional meetings, regional inputs, mutual referral processes, and at a macro, if you like, at a policy level. Vincent Hall is a National Social Justice Committee, I happen to be on it, but Gwen Harris, my colleague here, regional manager, is also on that committee. And out of that, it comes a lot of maybe joint submissions and problem solving very, very quickly by being at the table and talking, having that channel of communication. Also have other supports locally and in Dublin, family supports, Astra Family Support. Of course, our sister organisation, Citizens Information Services, of course, absolutely vital in terms of providing good, independent, objective information and advocacy on behalf of people who are trying to navigate a very complex social welfare system. Also, MABS got involved in Community Call. So there's a range. I could list another, quite a host of other organisations with which MABS became involved. So we need to retain that. So by working, the message there is, no organisation has an answer, but by working together, you can make actually a difference while still advocating for changes at a policy level. And there is a policy, CIB produce, make policy submissions as well. So there's a forum for that. But of course, despite all that, our best efforts and the collaboration, the use of multi-channels, which are superb at reaching out to people we've never reached before, making it accessible using the communication channel of their choice at a time, hopefully, of their choice as well. We must not leave others behind. And there was a question there, I don't know whether it was Fidelma, but there was a question there about the face-to-face, the in-person. And I'd be very strong on that. There are people who either are unable to communicate except through in person, or who are uncomfortable, and who, it's a very vulnerable position a person's in when they want to go and look for financial help or financial advice. What does that feel like? If you want to talk about a person, I'm facing a disconnection with my electricity bill, I can't manage, whatever. How vulnerable are you at that situation? So it's very understandable that many people wish to engage face-to-face. And there was a colleague retiring here from North Dublin MABS there last year, and I spoke to her on the phone to wish her well before she went in. One piece of advice, she said to me, listen, don't forget the face-to-face. That's one thing I would leave with you. Do not forget that. I know we're doing all these other things, which are wonderful, but don't forget those people. And that comes across in other services as well, so that we must never forget those. The other area I think we should focus on as well is, while we have widened our reach, I think through the various channels that we've mentioned already, there are people I know myself from my work with Vincent de Paul who've never heard of MABS, who would benefit greatly from MABS. These are people on low income, the people who are coming, but there's another similar profile of people who are not coming to us at all because they haven't heard of us, they're not sure what you do, they're afraid to make that call. And we need to to consider creative ways of reaching out to those people and making it very easy. And I think that might require multi-agency efforts. For example, again, Vincent de Paul is in the homes. Well, we were before the pandemic. We are actually in the privileged position of going into people's homes. And I don't know how many times, and this is how I got involved in MABS, actually, was when I found myself often when I'm visiting a family and saying, have you heard of MABS, the Money Advice and Budgeting Service? Here's what they might be able to do. And I do recall, I digress for one moment, I do recall a family, that was trying to help, or we were trying to help, that had multiple bills, threatening letters, etc. They went to MABS, and afterwards they said, I can now sleep at night. What a tribute that was to MABS as well. I can now sleep. The debt still hadn't all gone away, but they could see a way of managing it. And so that, you know, that reaching out, that family had never heard of MABS. And there are hundreds of such situations where people who would benefit from MABS, but who haven't engaged, haven't heard of them. And even some service providers. I was talking to a service provider recently, never heard of MABS. So we still have more work to do in that area, I'm saying. But anyway, so let's retain the good things that we've learned, the lessons that have been learned from the pandemic, the agility that we've shown in responding to people, the responsiveness to reaching out, the collaboration, the mitigation of the pandemic, the effects of the pandemic. But I just quote the few figures that Vincent Paul released yesterday, the more recent ones. The earlier findings were similar to our experience, was similar to what Stuart had found in his excellent report. But just remember, I think some of these figures would point to, I expect, a significant increase in the calls on MAB services as we ease out, whenever that might be, of the pandemic, and the financial support are withdrawn, presumably. And we did see an indication that September, October, and the helpline, when we began to open up, just I think that was touched upon as well. You know, 24% of people in the survey was Red C conducted were saying they're cutting back on food, rent, or electricity. 24%. 22% are using savings on just essential items, not luxuries, day-to-day living expenses. 14% are falling behind on bills, such as rent, mortgage, utilities, or other payments. 7% are going into debt. These primarily the trend, not surprising, low-income families with children, lone parents in private rental accommodation, people who are sick or on some sort of a disability payment. So there's a challenge coming. We need to make sure we have enough resources to do that. We need to have the services in place, and you know, doing it, we can do, you know, resource MABS, of course, properly to do it, but also build on the cooperation with other agencies, so that collectively, at least, we feel we can make a more meaningful difference to people's lives. So I conclude on that note, and again, I congratulate Stuart on his excellent report and the staff for the cooperation, and also just on a personal note to wish Angela all the best in her new chapter. Angela encouraged me to remain within MABS when the regional companies were being set up. So thank you for that encouragement, Angela. Thanks very much, Sean.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you to all the previous speakers, Stuart and Nessan, for your good wishes. You're very kind. So I'm delighted to have got this invitation to North and South Dublin MABS to launch this social policy report. It is very timely. I would commend Dublin South MABS and North Dublin MABS for taking the opportunity, if you like. I mean, it's nothing if not opportunistic, to do some research on the financial impact of the pandemic on clients in the Dublin region. Stuart, thanks for setting out that context and the findings of the report. And Nessan, thanks for your observations, particularly your experiences with the work of St. Vincent de Paul. I'd like to start by just picking up some elements of the report, but I suppose firstly I'd like to acknowledge some the various government supports that have been provided, you know, such as supports from utility providers and the banks. The various moratoria and forbearance measures, they've assisted in cushioning the financial impact of COVID-19 in the short term. And at a strategic level, MABS has assisted indeed with the central bank with a targeted review of the standard financial statement, which has been the bane of all of our lives for a long time, or at least for the clients of MABS. A consultation paper was published and there were proposed amendments and enhancements. So I suppose we'd have to say at least that's progress there that we didn't have before. And I'm really glad that MABS has now got a seat at these various tables and is a very central participant in some of these changes and debates. I suppose those consultations have given us the opportunity to comment on the Code of Conduct and mortgage arrears as well, more widely. Also, that Private Residential Tenancies Act has included MABS as a source of support for tenants in rent arrears. And I think that's been an important acknowledgement of MAB's central role, and also the fact that rent arrears are unlikely to be an isolated debt in anyone's house. So I suppose it's often, rent arrears are often accompanied by so many other stresses and debts, and it's really obvious that tenants need the kind of holistic service that MABS is able to offer just to help them navigate past their problems. Of course, I welcome all these variety of supports for citizens, but I'm very conscious of the uncertainties created by the various revisions of the government timetables. For example, the uncertainty around the ending of the PUP payment, which has been extended a couple of times and now is extended to June 2021. The utility forbearance dates were changed and revised. The eviction moratoria were also changed and revised in alignment with the 5K movement limited. The bank payments breaks, they saw a big build-up up to September 2020, and we were very vocal and loud in our horror at the idea that there would be a cliff edge finish to those payment breaks. And they were further extended, but only on a case-by-case basis. I mean, the reason I'm mentioning all of these is not to criticise the supports, but to point out that the uncertainty levels continue to lead to confusion among citizens, particularly among the vulnerable clients of MABS. And I find it hard to credit that we haven't learned, you know, we talk about mental health and we exacerbate the mental health issue all the time by not giving certainty to people in all these various crucial areas of their daily life. I suppose my other big concern is that the financial services landscape is changing. The planned exit of Ulster Bank from the Republic, the reduction in the number of Bank of Ireland branches, PTSB going cashless in 44 locations. I mean, it's also a feature of articles in the UK media at the moment that Provident, the main moneylender in the Republic of Ireland, may go into administration. This contraction of the banking and credit industry isn't good for Irish consumers. And the impact will be felt, of course, as always, more acutely by vulnerable clients. For example, as you described in your report, these gaps in the market may provide more opportunities for illegal money lending. And we all know the huge loss of wealth to the community that this implies when people have to pay more for their credit. There's no savers in this group of people. I suppose also it'll bring negative consequences for budgeting and money management for those more vulnerable and marginalised or financially excluded clients of MABS. I think these challenges demonstrate a huge need and opportunity for MABS to try to educate people on alternatives like post office accounts, credit unions who offer current account services, even the household budget scheme. People will continue to need education in basic accounting and budgeting skills to more fully understand options for borrowing and saving. Because with bank branch closures and more citizens being pushed online, MABS could consider educating people on how to access their bank accounts online, how to be vigilant about online fraud, etc. I think the pandemic has brought many woes, but it has also increased the use of technology. And of course, a lot of older people have learned for the first time how to video call the grandchildren or how to shop online, how to attend a weekly church service through the internet. So technology does, I guess, present opportunities to spread the message to a wider audience efficiently. I suppose our minds are focused at the moment on the pandemic, and it looks like there will be for some time to come. But there's been previous research by MABS and by other bodies that highlights a very low level of financial resilience among certain categories of people in Ireland. And the previous research in MABS on fuel poverty that Ballyfermot MABS initiated highlighted the higher percentage of income that poorer households always pay for fuel and heating. That's the much talked about poverty premium that Stuart knows well and Nessan's very familiar with as well. Paying for things in installments always costs more than being able to pay in a single lump. And one of the issues when you were speaking about, you know, why it costs more for poorer people, I was thinking of remember the top-up cards, the utility bill when you pay by card, there's an administration fee. And I remember, you know, back in my generation, dozens of years ago, you would have a phone card. But if you had plenty of money, you could buy a phone card for, we'll say, £20 or something, and you'd get lots of calls on it. If you had very little money, you'd get one for a fiver, and you'd get very little for it. It wasn't actually a pro rata. There was a premium on buying the smaller card. It's always been the case, and somehow I don't know how it emerged to be socially acceptable that if you couldn't pay more for something, that you had to pay a premium for the small version. You know, I'm not sure if I explained that very well, but I think you know what I mean. So the less money, so paying for things in installments, as I said, is always costing more than making a single lump payment. And the less money you're able to put into your bank account, the higher your banking fees will be. And the 2020 task report on exploring household debt in Ireland said that about a third of low-income households in Ireland struggle to meet everyday living costs, and they're consistently failing to meet their debt repayments as they fall due. For single parents, that goes up to 36%, and for the unemployed, it's up to 40%. So we've heard from the report presented earlier, there's no doubt that COVID and the resultant economic situation will exacerbate these statistics. And the low level of financial resilience and the precarity amongst households in Ireland needs to be continually highlighted by MABS. Looking at addressing some of these areas at issues at local level, I'd like to acknowledge what North and South Dublin MABS have done and the work you're undertaking in the area of money management education. That Money Makes Sense programme run by the Northside Partnership in conjunction with TASC has a key MABS component. Money advisors delivering a 24-week financial capability and coaching programme for specific target groups in the community. And of course, when COVID arrived, you were very proactive in redesigning that programme so that it could facilitate participants to get their training online via their mobile phones. Likewise, south of the Liffey, work is continuing with local community partners and outreach programmes, such as the student budgeting programme with Technological University of Tallaght, which again has been facilitated to go online. I think these initiatives demonstrate how MABS are addressing local needs and adapting to accommodate clients during the pandemic. This week also happens to be Global Money Week, and of course, COVID has impacted on school visits, but MABS personnel right around the country have been very much involved, although virtually this year, in the financial education of our younger people, in understanding the difference between spending needs as opposed to spending wants. In looking forward to the year ahead, and of course I am looking forward to the year ahead because I'm due to retire soon, I'm going to be as optimistic as I can in saying that my fervent hope is that, well, pending all public health measures, etc., that all MABS staff will be in a position to return to their offices, because the needs for MABS is predicted to be very high because of this pipeline of accumulated debt that is likely to be happening as people are relying on PUP as their sole income source. So people will face the financial consequences of the pandemic, and it has taught us how to be innovative in many different ways about the MABS service offer. And that will probably need to change and adapt into the future. But of course, some people still have a preference for the face-to-face service. There are also opportunities to reach out using technology. And the pandemic enforced an online and remote-only service on CIB-funded companies for the most part. And that no doubt will affect the future of remote work and service delivery. But we don't want to ape what the bank solution has been and make people talk to the wall. And I think that's a very regrettable feature in banks. And I suppose I'm not interested in moving everything online, even though, you know, IT has been my background from years ago. I'm interested in making the services more effective and efficient. And I think I'd be looking almost at a kind of an advocacy type relationship between MABS and their clients, rather than just this kind of nomenclature that is service, which is eminently conducive to be moved online. I'm not thinking of a service that can be moved online. I'm thinking about an advocacy relationship with the client that is necessary for the relationship to be whole and complete. So on the technology front, I'm very happy with that kind of proviso. that I'm very happy to mention that CIB intends to establish a cross-service digital strategy working group to provide a forum for CIB and representatives of the 21 CIB-funded companies to come together as part of information gathering, consultation and discovery project. I suppose the discovery is really to discover, what do people want? What do clients want? What do citizens need? Not a discovery of how much we can put online as fast as we can. That was enforced on us through COVID. It was necessary at the time, but it's not sustainable in the long term unless we are to actually diminish our service by calling it just a service that can be moved online. It's not just a service. It's an advocacy for clients to bring them from a state of inhibition, fear, debt difficulty into a state of where, you know, there's no KPI in the world that I have seen that reflects a message that I was sent recently, which is, you have helped people sleep better at night. Where's the metric for that? And that's what we need to do. But it's very difficult to have the metric for that says, this is what we do and this is what we need to continue to do. Moving everything online, will that do that? I don't think so. One thing that I think that, you know, I miss my visits to MABS and I miss reading the thank you cards. I mean, how could you capture the success of MABS? Would you send all the thank you cards into the 160 odd pigeonholes in Dáil Éireann and say, look, this is what MABS does? You know, I wonder, is that how we're to measure the success? By actually, you know, vocalizing what people are saying to MABS and expressing on their behalf to the decision makers that this is how important it is to have this holistic service. I think it just trips off the tongue, has done for so many years, that people think, oh, MABS does a holistic service, and no one is actually thinking about what that actually means. It means that only part of it can go online, but the remainder, as Stuart is very emphatic on, has to be a face-to-face, client-facing service of advocacy. So I suppose the group, as I was talking about, the digital strategy group, will have to be citizen-focused. We'll have to make sure the discussions and recommendations are predicated on the need for continuous improvement of service. Like I say, we won't have people talking to the wall like they have to do in banks. The digital strategy produced will have to reach out to people who are not currently using our service. So we're not reaching everyone, and that's a given. You know, we're not reaching some young people that we could reach, but we have lost a lot of people through the pandemic that we have to continue to reach somehow. So we want to increase the organizational effectiveness through the digital strategy. And as I said, not just turn everything online. For example, Dublin South MABS recently volunteered to become involved in an e-signing pilot, which is a component of the digital strategy. In being inclusion focused, I think the working group that we're setting up for digital strategy will recognize citizens who prefer to access services through non-digital channels, and they should be allowed to continue always to exercise that preference. So I suppose just before I finish up, can I congratulate you in Dublin South MABS and North Dublin MABS for undertaking this research on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it certainly counters some of the official statistical narrative on the increase in savings in the economy as a result of the less opportunity to spend. It certainly gives insight into the people who didn't experience any income lift as a result of the social distancing measures. Only great expense is what they experienced. It noted clients newly presenting were predominantly those without any prior engagement with MABS, in contrast to their predecessors. And that suggests that there may be a large number of people experiencing a worrying financial difficulty, perhaps for the first time. I trust that the findings presented today will inform further social policy initiatives, and I'm proud that we can sponsor and support such initiatives, and that it could be followed up with practical local actions and programs. I'm very confident that MABS is well placed to do just that. And finally, as I take my leave of CIB due to retirement in the next few weeks, can I say how proud I am of your work and your dedication, no more so than now as we face the challenges of COVID-19. And I thank you most sincerely for your individual and your collective support over the past 6.5 years or so. So it gives me great pleasure, therefore, to formally launch the Social Distancing on the Margins report. Thank you.
Your Mahagad, Angela, and in particular for the positivity and the encouragement you have demonstrated towards the service, and a lot of positive messages there about going forward, in particular around the relationship and an advocacy relationship with services, and the importance of face-to-face contact. There are a few questions coming in, and I'm going to bring them in quickly. And again, if you see that the benefit of Nesson or Stuart come in as well, please do in observations or comments. I'll take them as I have them here. The first thing, there is Electric Ireland's hardship fund, and the question is, can other creditors be approached or encouraged to come up with similar schemes for the marginalised? And that could be a way for creditors to redeem themselves as well. That's one question. The other questions are related more to, going forward in terms of the services. I'll hold on that one. That question for creditors and their position as things are, and looking ahead, how they can address hardship issues for the marginalised. Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, go ahead, Stuart. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, just real quickly. Yeah, yes, absolutely. One idea that's been kicked around, and it's used in other countries and even in other contexts in Ireland, is the idea of a levy on financial institutions and indeed public service creditors, on the sort of polluter pays type principle. I think there's a strong argument for that. Levies already contribute, as I understand it, to the Financial Services and Pensions Ombudsman. They also contribute to consumer education, the CPCC, some of their work around financial education. So, yeah, by all means, I think, we can approach and ask, but I think there's also an argument for a more sort of proactive sort of approach, maybe by something like a levy, which, as I say, is in line with the polluter pays principle.
Okay.
If I could just talk about is there anybody other than Electric Ireland who can, be supportive of marginalised people? One thing that has always struck me is that in downtimes, in relation to, there isn't much of it in Electric Ireland, but in downtimes and outages in relation to broadband and telephone services, I've never seen people get money back for those downtimes or outages of lack of service. And I often think that, as Stuart mentioned earlier, there's a huge imbalance. The people who hold all the capital and the power are the ones who actually benefit, if you like, from downtimes in services. For people who spend an awful lot phoning up about their broadband connection or spend an awful lot of money on hold to get a service, I wonder, is there a case for actually asking, whether it's Vodafone or whatever the operator is, for money back for downtime? Because an awful lot of people, a lot of calls to Joe Duffy wouldn't be calls to Joe Duffy if people hadn't got so exasperated by chalking up 12 hours on the phone in the past 2 years in trying to resolve their problem. And because everyone has a mobile phone now, it often is more costly to actually phone up and be left on hold for ages. And I just often thought that there must be some kind of a margin of profit for companies, and it certainly doesn't ever, it's never reflected in the caller. The caller is never compensated for all the effort that it took. So I'd love to monetize that effort and just give it back to, whoever, Vodafone customers, Virgin Media customers, all the customers who've spent all that time. And at the end of their rope, then they call into MABS. And if those other things hadn't happened, there wouldn't have to be, I wouldn't want more customers of MABS. I mean, I'd like fewer clients of MABS, but only because their problems are being resolved at source and not having to come to MABS after a year of frustration or whatever, you know, in making calls.
Thanks, Angela, for that. Just two brief comments before I go to the next questions. One is compliments to all three of you for passion in your presentations. Much appreciated by a number of viewers. A quick one for you, Nessun, to note rather than to respond to right now, but you mentioned how many people have never heard of MABS, and I think you mentioned in the middle of there somewhere a service provider, maybe one of them, but certainly people in the media end of our services, and including DIB, would be very interested in responding to that with appropriate information. So if you've something you can feed in there on that one, that would be useful. Two more issues that I'm referring to you, Angela, before you go out the door, if you can respond, even though they may relate to how individual companies respond, but I'll read them out briefly to you. One is what plans might be in place in terms of reopening currently closed offices, because accessibility will be a genuine issue as things hopefully resume in the next while. And the other was in relation to the importance of when we're coming out of the pandemic, the challenges ahead, whether or not additional resources would be available to services to meet that challenge. And then there's one final comment I want to throw in here that might be helpful, and that is the whole area of credit unions. But I'll take the first two now for you, Angela, in terms of services and opening up and where we go in the future, you know.
Well, I suppose, you know, every plan we made for reopening was stymied by the numbers in the pandemic, if you like.
Yeah.
And all we could do, I mean, the first reopening, I think, if I remember, the 29th of June, we had to actually see MABS in terms of what kind of a model does it replicate. And the nearest model we had from the government advice and all the guidance was that of retail services. So from that point of view, sometime I think in around April, we said, well, maybe by the 29th of June, in line with the recent government guidelines for retail services, MABS will be able to open. And in the meantime, all the assessments and audits of the facilities were done. And it was found that only in some cases could they really open, because some places were too small and couldn't, the layer of health and safety had to be added, you know, onto all of the other rationales for being able to accept clients. So that's why it was actually arrived at the conclusion that only emergency face-to-face appointments can be made, because there had to be a certain limit to the number of people. You see it in chemists, you see it in shops, the number of people allowed in at any one time. But I would, as I said, I'm optimistic about the coming year and about the reopening. We've had various reopenings of MABS, if you like, at various times. But in level 5, you can't reopen anything because we're not in compliance. And I think it's down to level 3 before you have any kind of facility to be safe and safely reopen. But I have to commend MABS that it was almost overnight, and our own IT support people, that actually they reversed everything they had ever known and done and said, let's use MABS Messenger as an additional channel. Let's enhance the helpline. Let's provide the service by phone, by email. We did a similar thing in CISs where we did a callback service. So I think we've done what we can. We will open up MABS as soon as possible, but we won't let the staff be unsafe or exposed to any danger no more than any other service. I think the point we've made is, yes, MABS is an essential service, but we are not going to actually, I suppose, usurp the facilities needed by, we'll say, nurses and doctors, etc., to be mobile in the community. So yes, it's an essential service, but it can be provided from a static location, such as the home, etc., to a certain extent. And that's why it'll have to be in large locations that we would begin to open up. Now, I can't predict the future, whether there'll be a gradual or an overnight opening up later this year. I'm not sure, but it certainly would be our plan to open ASAP.
Yeah, one of the, I think a subset of that question would be in relation to some of the offices, you know, there might be partial reopening, you're touching on that, but the whole issue of health and safety provisions being very high bar during COVID, but after COVID, does it need to be as high a bar? That's a separate question maybe, but, you know, well, I don't have any comments on that.
Yeah, well, I think because we put in, you know, because we provisioned, I think it was like for a partial refurb was about 600 per office and a full refurb was about 1,500 per office. And because that's already in place, I think, you know, that will be, I suppose, an added comfort to people when after the pandemic is over. Yeah. But, you know, we have done this, if you like, on a just-in-time basis. About every 6 weeks for the last year, we've been examining the various levels, the various locations, etc. Remember, we've over 200 locations around the country. So there's as many nuances as there are locations. So you can't actually fix on one single answer about
which would cover the likes of CISs maybe having a different approach as well to a MABS service in theory or in practice.
Well, I mean, I think the CISs did something similar, and they said only in the case of emergency could they deliver face to face. And again, that was only in the case of big urban locations where there was plenty of room. The you know, small offices that couldn't cater for more than 3 people inside or couldn't have a queue system. We have to remember that what we would do in the summer or the autumn might be different. We couldn't have people standing out in the rain in the winter outside of a small office. Whereas, you know, the response over the summer period might be different if things get better, you know.
I have one final question, Angela, to you first, and if others may have time to comment. But in terms of the financial, your concerns about financial services and the changes that have been started, if you like, in recent times, do you see a case for the state enhancing supports for credit unions, if you like, to respond to that gap or to improve the balance of offers that are there?
Well, I do think that you know, I chair a task force on the extension of personal microcredit. And I do think that work dovetails with, I suppose, the proposal which originally came as a private member's bill from the opposition about capping the interest rate charged by moneylenders. And where that meets credit unions in the middle somehow would be that credit unions would be allowed to increase their charges. So I suppose in some way it's a kind of a squeeze of money lenders. So in a way, that's a de facto support for credit unions to allow them actually make money from small loans. And it's somewhere in between, you know, at the moment, they're the only ones with the cap on interest rates in the country, 1% per month. If they were allowed to charge something more, but something that's not like the 288% of money lenders, then that would bring us somewhere closer to what is more reasonable, I think, you know.
Okay. Very conscious of time. And Stuart, do you want to come in briefly? Yeah.
Very briefly, one liner. Yeah, the question from Olive there, I fully agree. And state support for credit unions, I think it's a very good model for it, which was, if you remember, New Labour. My goodness, what happened to them? In the late 90s and noughties in the UK, they piloted the idea of a growth fund where the state would actually look at putting collateral into credit unions and similar sort of third sector bodies, if you like, but particularly credit unions, and set up credit unions to provide collateral to help them to provide credit to people who would, you know, maybe have difficulty getting it elsewhere. I think it was evaluated, as I remember, by the Personal Finance Research Centre very positively. But that scheme was wound up, I think, by the incoming Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. So I think there's something we could look at there and maybe use and draw on. I think it's a really good idea and suggestion.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to call things to a halt because I'm conscious of time, and I'm very grateful for all of your time and our participants for staying with us. You know, it's not easy to stick with any technology medium like this so long. But anyway, there are lots of people you have already thanked, Stuart, and I want to echo that. And I'll add in the CIB tech team and others in the background who are organising this, who are not visible in the last while. So many thanks to all of those. And again, my thanks to Stuart, to Nessun, and to Angela. And I want to wish you all the best, respectively. So, Gordamin Magav, Agus Amor or Choligwena, and we'll meet again. But anyway, all the best for now.